Hi, I'm James McGuire, and on today's eSpeaks, we're talking about cloud native computing, definitely the forward-looking trend in cloud these days. We'll also look at the stunning growth in the hyperscalers and talk about what that means for customers. To discuss all that, I'm joined by someone who knows more about cloud than just about anyone. With me is Bernard Golden, Executive Technical Advisor at VMware. Bernard, good to have you with us today.
Hey, James, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really pleased to be here and look forward to our conversation.
Absolutely. You've written a couple of interesting articles for eWEEK. You're an eWEEK contributor, which I'm happy about. The first one is called "Why Cloud Means Cloud Native." Definite audience for that article. I want to talk to you about why that's true. But first, what's your sense of how companies are approaching cloud these days, cloud native these days? I mean, are they getting on board? Are they looking at it reluctantly? What's your sense?
My sense is that there's an increasing appetite for it. Um, Many companies have made some steps toward it. I'm talking about mainstream enterprises.
Hmm.
Obviously, companies like Netflix or Lyft, they're pretty much all in. But
Sure.
in terms of mainstream enterprises, I think there's quite an aspiration to start adopting these kinds of practices. Of course, there's challenges, and that they have to address, but there's an increasing awareness that that's kind of the future of the way applications need to be um, designed and operated,
Mhm.
and an increasing appetite to figure that out and take that on.
Hmm. So I mean, it seems like in terms of cloud native, companies would look at it and go, well, there's all sorts of advantages, but there's going to be a larger upfront cost. We'd rather just keep going with the legacy system. Is that part of what's going on?
Well, for sure, every company has to look at their portfolio, their application suite, their application portfolio, and say which are the applications that you know are steady state, aren't going to change, or maybe even we really want to retire it. Well, you're not obviously not going to invest in them to bring them up to current modern standards.
Right.
There's some that you say, gosh, we're really gated by how often we can update these things or how easily we can update these things. Those are ones that are candidates to uh, rewrite into cloud native design patterns.
Hmm.
And then you've maybe got some that are kind of like, we're going to just leave as is and just run them the way they are. And um, one time I took a visit to a data center, and it was pretty funny because we went to one floor and they went, all these cool things, and there was another floor that they went, all these are great things. We got to one floor, and I said, so what are all these things? And they said, we have no idea, and so our rule around here is we just don't touch them. Well, every enterprise has kind of those don't touch them, leave them undisturbed, they're just running.
Hmm.
And so everybody has to analyze their application portfolio and figure out what those buckets are and so forth. And then one tranche of that suite, that portfolio, sorry, is candidates for upgrading or updating to cloud native. And of course, new is often going to fall into that category. You're going to start off with the best practices, most modern techniques.
Love the data center story, and I think it's probably more true in more companies than maybe people would want to admit. All right, so the title of your article is "Why Cloud Means Cloud Native." Why is that true? Why does cloud mean cloud native these days?
Yeah. Well, let's start. I often have a mantra about the way customers look at companies. And
Mhm.
I'll say customer, but it could be partner, could be even employee. And my mantra is every phone call a failure. And what I mean by that is every standard kind of interaction with a company should be something that can be done online or in a mobile app.
Hmm.
The only time you should have to talk to a person, and by talk, I mean either on a phone or with chat, is when
Mhm.
you're doing, my belief is when you're doing something out of the ordinary.
Mhm.
Mainstream stuff should be done electronically, should be enabled electronically.
Mhm.
Okay, so that's the mantra, because that's the way people want to do business today, right? I mean, that's
Right.
just so um, with that, you sort of look at what's the cloud uh, what has cloud computing brought? Well, cloud computing has brought a transformation in infrastructure. You can get access to resources within minutes as opposed to weeks or months.
Mm-hmm.
You can get more resources if you need them within minutes. All of that stuff is fantastic. The only thing is, customers, employees, partners, they don't want efficient infrastructure. They want effective applications. And so you sort of say, well, what are effective applications? Well, let's use an example. I was just thinking about this. Let's say that a particular car rental company has decided to start offering electric vehicles as part of their suite, their fleet. And I say, gosh, I'm going to be doing a vacation starting April 15th. I'd like to rent one of those. Well, my expectation is I should be able to, the day that they go and announce that, I should be able to go online and rent that kind of car. If I have to go, oh, I can't do that in the app, I can't do that online, I've got to call somebody and say, hey, I want to do this, blah, blah, blah. To me, that's a failure from a customer point of view.
That's a problem. Yeah, people don't want to do that.
Right. So the implication is I need to have, if I'm the company, and by implication, the IT organization, I've got to be able to update that application frequently, easily. And by the way, a lot of people decide they want to do this with this electric vehicles, and you get 20 times the number of reservations. Well, your application needs to be able to scale that way. And so that's about application, not about efficient infrastructure. So effective applications need to be able to be updated frequently. They need to be resilient so they don't crash when a lot of people come on. They have to be able to scale to handle traffic. They have to run quickly. All of those things are really reflective of cloud native practices, the kinds of designs, architectures, and then application practices, and then operational practices that support that kind of effective application. You know, frequent updates, easy updates, incremental updates to just a portion, because you don't want to rewrite the entire application or have to put out an entire thing. You want to be able to update just the inventory and the reservation process.
Right.
So you want to be able to do that. So that's those things, the things that people want. Effective applications require cloud native practices. Typically, those require running on cloud infrastructure because that's efficient infrastructure. But the effective applications require cloud native practices.
When I'm going to, in reference to the software model you just mentioned, let's name a few buzzwords that we want to say that it means cloud native. And it says like microservices, containers. What are the other foundational tools that pretty much mean cloud native?
Yeah, well, so I want to be able to update the inventory and the assets that show in the functionality, and maybe I've got to add some kind of functionality to say, you know, are these, you know, is there charging stations in the locale, right? So I have to update that part of the application.
Right.
As I said, you don't want to update the entire rest of it. That
of course
commonly implies I'm going to go to a microservices kind of thing, so I can update that piece of the application without having to, you know, affect all the rest of it.
Right.
And so that's a kind of a partitioned application where I can update one part of it frequently, but maybe not have to touch any part of the, you know, the payment mechanism.
Sure.
Or
it's
you know,
not
those
a
kinds of
monolith. It's broken into
right.
parts.
So you partition the application. There you are with microservices. What was the second thing that you mentioned?
Containers.
Yeah.
Really?
Well, what's attractive about containers is they tend to increase the velocity of applications update frequency, because you basically build it once during the development, right? So the software engineer is adding new functionality to the application. So that part of the application that does the vehicle mechanisms that we were just talking about, that a software engineer in that group, in that working on that microservices, updates it, and then it puts that new code into a container. That container then gets created, sent off the testing, or probably there should be automated testing, which is another cloud native practice. It passes those kinds of things. That same container then can go to staging, where it gets put into an environment that mimics the production environment to make sure that it can connect and plays well with everything else in the application, and then can be promoted into production, all without changing the container. That's a lot more convenient than, oh, it's got to go over to testing where you need to build a new virtual machine, and now it's going to be deployed into, let's say, a different environment, because maybe you've developed it on a laptop, but now it's got to be deployed into one of the hyperscale providers. You don't want to have to rebuild a virtual machine to install the code into it. So containers enables that rapid velocity, and that's a very common practice. I won't say you can't do it with containers, but I would say that, kind of the commonly accepted practice in the industry is, if you want to move to these cloud native practices, you're going to be container based.
Right, right. Well, and on that very subject, I'd love to get a couple of cloud native best practices. I mean, you mentioned it in your article, why cloud means cloud native, but I would assume this almost like iterates as we go month by month now. So what are a couple of cloud native best practices?
Well, you mentioned containers, and so it's sort of a set of those things is, bringing in environments that support containers, and that commonly, not totally, but commonly means I'm going to run it in a Kubernetes environment. So you're going to have a Kubernetes cluster and Kubernetes practices. Excuse me. That typically means, from an operational perspective, you need to have a set of tools that can work in a Kubernetes environment. One of the things about Kubernetes and containers tends to be very transient resources. A container may come up, it may run for 15 minutes, it may go down. Another one might come up and replace it, might even run on a different node. So your monitoring, your observability, all has to engage with that. So you need those kinds of modern tools for operational practices. From a development perspective, we talked about, that containers enable a greater velocity. You need a pipeline. It's often referred to as a pipeline, but sometimes in the past was referred to an application lifecycle management, something that will support that kind of speed. So I'm going to check in some code. I want to kick off an automated build, so nobody has to wait and do it manually. You want to run those tests. I said automated tests. You want to have that be part of the pipeline. And even further upstream from that, right? So before the developer sits down, before the software engineer sits down and starts typing, you want to have a set of artifacts and resources that they can use that jumpstart their effort. So they don't have to go install, oh, we use this version of this thing, and we use this version of this library and all that. You want to create a template that they go, oh, I'm creating this kind of application. I press this button, up comes a kind of a pre-filled out, soft code base that has a lot of the stuff that you want in there, that already has the right libraries, that already has the kind of pre-configured things that will then implement your security policies. Those are common cloud native practices. We also talked about microservices. So you've got an architectural pattern. So that's a very common thing that reflects not individual code pieces, but more the overall design of your application and the way they communicate. So those are very common cloud native practices.
Interesting. Well, you wrote another article about cloud growth. I love the articles. You cover how fast the hyperscalers are growing. It's pretty amazing. Amazon Web Services, Microsoft, Google Cloud. I mean, what does their enormous growth mean for customers, though?
Well, their enormous growth really reflects customer adoption. And I think, we get a little bit jaded or just so used to it that we don't even really remark on it very much about how astonishing these results are. But, these are 40, 50, $60 billion a year businesses. Those are huge businesses. And they're growing at 30, 40, 50% a year on year, which is really just about unprecedented across the entire technology industry, and certainly across any kind of economy. And so but that's driven by user adoption. So really, this is kind of the smoke signal, or the smoke, and the fire is customer adoption. And what that really says is that customers are migrating very extensively from their own data centers into these hyperscalers, as a way of saying, I no longer want to be investing capital into what are, again, it'll become more efficient, but it's still not where the value is. The value is effective applications. And they're saying, I want to get out of low value, kinds of activities running a data center and into higher value activities, which is creating effective applications and using them to engage with customers, partners, and employees.
Does the fact that the hyperscalers are growing so much, of course, that does reflect that the customers are coming on board more and more and more, but do the hyperscalers' growth itself mean that they offer a more hospitable environment for customers?
Well, I don't know about hospitable per se, but what I would say is that they, again, as we started off by saying, they provide a much more efficient environment.
Mm-hmm.
They've designed an entire software infrastructure on top of the sort of networks and switches and servers and all that, so-called control plane that enables me to stand up a database in 10 minutes, as opposed to the traditional model, which is I've got to budget and buy servers, blah, 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 that can take weeks or months. They've made a huge investments to provide a control plane that enables that efficient infrastructure. And so, that just reflects that it's easier now to use, I think is the right way to think about it.
Uh-huh. The one thing that surprised me recently, I've heard this from a number of people, not at all rare. People have used the term repatriation, where they've moved to the cloud and they realize, you know what, we want to move it back. And I'm thinking, really? You're moving back? I mean, if I heard this for just one or a couple people, I'd be like, okay, that's an odd little case. But I've heard it from a number of people. Have you heard about this idea, like repatriation? Companies are moving some stuff back from the cloud?
Yeah, definitely. And I've encountered it.
No.
And a very common reason for doing that is they move something to the cloud, and they think somehow that it's going to be cheaper, and it turns out that maybe it's not cheaper, and then oftentimes they end up with these sort of cost surprises or sticker shock. And I guess there's a couple of things that I would say about that. The first is, if you take an application designed under the old model and move it to an efficient infrastructure, it itself is not necessarily efficient. The old model was, you don't know how much demand there's going to be, so buy really big, and that way you won't run out. Well, if you do that in a cloud provider, guess what? I always liken that to, it's like parking a taxi down at the bottom of your driveway in case you might want to take a drive, and then wondering why it's so expensive. Well, that's why. Right. So that's part of it, is a sticker shock, and that also reflects the best way to get. You want to tune your cost to your usage, and those cloud native design practices that we talked about, where you partition the application, grow it as demand grows, but then shrink it back down using transitory resources. Those are all practices that better match your cost to your use. If you don't do those things, you're likely to find, gosh, this application doesn't run any better just because I'm running in a hyperscaler than it did when I ran it in my own thing. And it was inefficient when I ran it in my own thing. It's inefficient there. It's very expensive. So that's sometimes a cause. So cost. I've often encountered that some companies have intellectual property reasons for thinking about migrating back out of, they might say, we compete with this provider in some dimension. And for risk management practices, they say, I want to move this back. That's another reason that people do it. I guess overall, though, if you say that the hyperscalers are growing, 40, 50% a year, that sort of implies that there's a lot more going in than there is coming out.
Right. Of that, I think we can be pretty sure. Bernard, I think we could talk for another 2 hours, but I think we're more or less out of time today. I greatly appreciate you sharing your expertise. Thank you very much, and come back soon.
Yeah, it's been fantastic. Thank you so much for inviting me.